A patrol officer's flashlight paused on frost-darkened concrete behind a closed storefront, catching a detail that should not have been there. A stillness that resisted the cold, a shape outlined by snow drift and shadow, as if winter itself had hesitated, leaving evidence exposed for just one breath longer. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Milwaukee was already settling into its long December when the discovery was logged, a city used to cold mornings and early darkness, a place where factory whistles and church bells once set the rhythm of working life. In 1985, downtown corridors emptied quickly after dusk, and the neighborhoods tightened inward against the lake wind. The body found behind the shuttered camera repair shop off North Avenue belonged to a young woman later identified as 22-year-old Margaret Ellen Harlow, a clerical worker who had vanished 3 days before Christmas. She had been reported missing after failing to return to her parents' duplex on the city's west side. Her absence first noticed when a Thanksgiving decoration remained in the window long after it should have come down. Initial police reports noted no sign of struggle at the discovery site. There was no visible trauma consistent with immediate violence, no overturned trash, no disturbed snow beyond a narrow footprint pattern leading toward the alley. The location suggested placement rather than accident, a conclusion supported by the lack of exposure damage that would have been expected if she had been there longer than a night. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment, careful and restrained, estimated death within 48 hours of discovery, placing the timeline squarely between Christmas Eve and the early hours of December 26th. Margaret Harlow had been last seen leaving her office near Wisconsin Avenue on the afternoon of December 23rd. Coworkers described her as punctual, reserved, and dependable, the sort of young woman who mailed Christmas cards early and kept receipts folded neatly in her purse. Her car, a beige Chevrolet Citation, was found legally parked near her workplace, untouched, with gifts wrapped in department store paper visible on the back seat. There was no indication she had planned to travel far or meet anyone unexpectedly. Her wallet was missing, but identification was later recovered several blocks away, discarded near a bus stop. The investigation began as many did in the mid-1980s, with paper files and handwritten logs. Detectives canvassed the surrounding blocks, noting businesses closed for the holidays, security shutters pulled down, lights off. Milwaukee winters preserved scenes unevenly, freezing some details while erasing others. Snowfall the night of December 24th complicated footprint analysis, but officers documented what remained, photographing impressions before a forecasted thaw. The alley sat adjacent to a small camera repair shop that specialized in film development, its owner known for keeping odd hours. The shop's exterior wall held a mounted security camera, an uncommon precaution at the time, installed after a burglary the previous summer. The camera became a footnote in the initial reports. Investigators noted its presence but assumed the film, if any existed, would have been overwritten or unusable. Analog systems of the era relied on time-lapse recording and low-light conditions, often rendered images grainy. The shop owner, interviewed on December 27th, stated the camera was functional, but admitted he had not checked the footage in weeks. He handed over several reels of undeveloped film, stored in a metal drawer beneath the counter. They were logged into evidence and sent to the crime lab, a process that would take weeks due to holiday backlogs. Margaret's autopsy, conducted at the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's office, provided critical clarity without sensational detail. Cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, consistent with manual pressure, though no defensive injuries were documented. Toxicology returned negative for alcohol and common narcotics. Fingernail scrapings yielded trace fibers, later identified as synthetic, possibly from automotive upholstery or winter outerwear. The findings suggested control rather than frenzy, an encounter brief and deliberate. Media coverage reflected the season's contradictions. Local papers ran Margaret's photograph beside articles about Christmas charity drives and New Year's events. The tone was sober, emphasizing public safety without panic. Missing person flyers, already outdated, were quietly removed from grocery store bulletin boards. Her parents gave a single statement through police, requesting privacy and urging anyone with information to come forward. Tips arrived, as they always did, ranging from vague sightings to unsubstantiated rumors about transient populations drawn to holiday shelters. Each was logged, most dismissed after routine checks. By January 1986, the case had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Detectives reconstructed Margaret's last known movements using bus schedules, time cards, and store receipts. She had purchased wrapping paper at a downtown department store shortly after noon on December 23rd, confirmed by a register tape. She had withdrawn $40 from an ATM near her office, a transaction recorded on magnetic tape, but offering no visual confirmation. There were no known enemies, no recent romantic relationships of concern, and no history of risk-taking behavior. The alley where she was found was not on her direct route home. This deviation became a central question. Investigators considered whether she had accepted a ride, voluntarily or under perceived obligation. Milwaukee's winters encouraged such choices, especially for young workers eager to avoid waiting in the cold. Witness interviews focused on parking attendants, bus drivers, and shopkeepers who might recall a woman matching her description. Memory, however, was unreliable in a season crowded with routine and distraction. The camera shop footage, still undeveloped, lingered in the evidence queue. In an era before digital immediacy, patience was procedural, not strategic. Detectives moved on to other leads, including a similar assault reported in a neighboring district weeks earlier, though timelines and victim profiles did not align. By February, snowbanks receded, revealing nothing new. The case remained active but quiet, its file growing thicker as pages were added, each representing effort without resolution. Thanksgiving of that year passed with the case unsolved. Margaret's family marked the holiday privately, her absence now a fixed presence. Investigators rotated assignments, but the file stayed on the shelf labeled unsolved, a designation that carried both hope and resignation. Milwaukee's winters came and went, each one subtly erasing the immediacy of 1985. What remained was documentation, preserved in cold archives, waiting for a detail to surface that could withstand time. By the spring of 1986, the investigation entered a quieter phase, one defined less by urgency than by endurance. Detectives assigned to the case continued their periodic reviews, pulling Margaret Harlow's file from the cabinet, reading it again with fresh eyes, then returning it unchanged. Milwaukee's police department had no formal cold case unit at the time, only individual officers who carried unresolved files alongside active workloads. The Harlow case remained open, its evidence sealed and cataloged, its questions unanswered. The undeveloped camera footage from the North Avenue repair shop sat refrigerated in the evidence vault, preserved but unexamined. Laboratory memos noted repeated delays due to staffing shortages and higher priority violent crimes. Analog film required specialized handling, and low-light footage often produced unusable results. The reels were labeled, logged, and deferred. In the meantime, investigators pursued what they could verify. They rechecked bus transfer records, reviewed parking citations issued near the downtown office corridor, and compared Margaret's timeline with weather logs to understand pedestrian patterns during that particular December. One small detail began to draw renewed attention during a mid-year review. A handwritten note in the original Discovery report mentioned a faint clicking sound reported by a nearby resident around midnight on Christmas Eve, described as mechanical rather than human. At the time, the sound was dismissed as heating equipment or delivery trucks servicing holiday businesses. Months later, an investigator reconsidered the note in light of the camera mounted on the repair shop wall. Time-lapse cameras of that era advanced film at audible intervals, particularly in cold conditions when lubricants stiffened. This observation prompted a renewed request to the crime lab to process the film. By August 1986, the reels were finally developed. The results were initially underwhelming. Most frames showed little more than static alley views, blurred by snow and darkness. However, technicians identified a narrow window between 11:42 p.m. and 12:17 a.m. on December 24th where movement was visible. The images were indistinct, but they captured a vehicle entering the alley, pausing briefly, then exiting. The vehicle appeared to be a light-colored sedan, consistent with several common models of the early 1980s. Its license plate was unreadable, but its rear bumper carried a distinctive dent on the right side. Investigators enhanced the footage using the limited techniques available at the time, enlarging frames and adjusting contrast. The process introduced distortion but clarified one critical detail. The vehicle lacked a rear dealership emblem, suggesting either removal or an aftermarket modification. This evidence shifted the investigation's direction. Detectives cross-referenced local body shop records for repairs matching the bumper damage. They also reviewed vehicle registration databases within a 5-mile radius, focusing on light-colored sedans registered to men between 30 and 50 years old, a demographic profile statistically consistent with similar offenses. The list was long but manageable. Officers began the slow process of knocking on doors, inspecting vehicles, and documenting statements. Public attention briefly resurfaced when the local paper published a short follow-up article marking the case's one-year anniversary. The piece mentioned the security camera footage without detail, prompting a modest increase in tips. Most were redundant, but one call stood out. A former employee of the camera repair shop reported that a regular customer, a freelance photographer named Daniel R. Keller, had complained in late December 1985 about the alley camera interfering with his parking routine. Keller was known to visit after hours, using the alley for loading equipment. Keller, 43 at the time of Margaret's death, lived alone in a South Side apartment and drove a light gray Oldsmobile Cutlass. Records showed he had paid a body shop to repair rear bumper damage in early January 1986, citing a minor collision with a snowbank. The repair invoice noted removal of a dealership badge to accommodate repainting. Detectives obtained a warrant to inspect the vehicle, though by then the repairs were complete. A background check revealed no prior violent offenses, but Keller had a history of minor disputes with local businesses and a citation for disorderly conduct several years earlier. He was interviewed in October 1986. His account of Christmas Eve placed him home alone, editing photographs. He acknowledged using the alley frequently but denied being there that night. His demeanor was described as controlled, cooperative, and precise. He volunteered equipment receipts and calendars, none of which definitively corroborated his alibi. Investigators collected fiber samples from Keller's vehicle upholstery, comparing them to the synthetic fibers recovered from Margaret's fingernails. Initial analysis was inconclusive, limited by the technology of the time. The fibers were similar in composition to many commercially available materials. Without stronger linkage, Keller remained a person of interest rather than a suspect. The case stalled again, its momentum slowed by evidentiary limits. Years passed. Milwaukee changed, industries closed, and records migrated from paper to microfilm. Margaret Harlow's case moved with them, its boxes relocated to colder, quieter storage. Her parents aged, eventually passing without seeing resolution. Each December, the case resurfaced briefly in departmental reviews, then receded. Thanksgiving and Christmas came and went, marked in silence by those who still remembered. In the late 1990s, advances in forensic science prompted a renewed look at unsolved cases. The department established a small cold case review team, tasked with reassessing files using modern techniques. Margaret's case was among the first selected, notable for its preserved evidence and unresolved leads. The old film footage was digitized, frame by frame, revealing details previously lost to grain and shadow. The vehicle's bumper dent, once ambiguous, now appeared more distinctive, matching the repair profile documented in Keller's invoice. More importantly, touch DNA analysis had become viable. The synthetic fibers from Margaret's fingernails were re-examined, yielding trace biological material previously undetectable. A partial DNA profile was developed and entered into state databases. It did not produce an immediate match, but it narrowed the field. Investigators revisited Keller, now in his late 50s, living in a different county. His DNA was collected voluntarily under the pretext of elimination. The comparison, conducted quietly, produced a statistically significant match. The match did not announce itself loudly. It arrived as a lab report, several pages thick, attached to the case file with a paperclip that had already been bent and straightened too many times. The partial profile extracted from the fibers beneath Margaret Harlow's fingernails aligned with Daniel Keller's DNA at multiple loci, enough to exceed the threshold required for probable cause under contemporary standards. The finding did not stand alone, and investigators were careful not to treat it as a conclusion. It was a point of convergence, one that demanded methodical confirmation. Cold case protocols required corroboration beyond biological coincidence. Detectives reconstructed Keller's movements during December 1985 using archived employment records, bank transactions, and dated photographic negatives recovered from his former studio. The negatives, preserved in envelopes marked with dates and locations, showed a conspicuous absence on December 24th. While absence alone proved nothing, it contrasted with Keller's habitual documentation of routine work. His bank records placed him withdrawing cash from an ATM less than 2 blocks from the alley on the night Margaret disappeared, a transaction time-stamped at 11:18 p.m. The digitized camera footage was reviewed again, this time alongside Keller's vehicle history. Frame enlargement clarified a roof-mounted rack visible for less than a second as the sedan entered the alley. Keller's Oldsmobile had been fitted with such a rack for transporting lighting equipment, a detail confirmed by photographs from his portfolio. Investigators compared spacing, alignment, and mounting hardware, not inconsistencies that were unlikely to be coincidental. Witness statements from 1985 were re-examined with renewed focus. A parking attendant who had worked the holiday shift near Wisconsin Avenue recalled, in a statement given years earlier, a man fitting Keller's description lingering near the office buildings after dusk. At the time, the observation had been logged without emphasis, one of dozens recorded during the initial canvass. Now, it acquired new relevance. In early 2001, investigators presented their findings to the district attorney's office. The review process was deliberate, accounting for the age of the case and the necessity of airtight procedure. Prosecutors evaluated the chain of custody for every piece of evidence, from the undeveloped film reels to the fiber samples stored since the Reagan administration. No breaks were identified. The decision to proceed was approved, contingent on one final step: a comprehensive re-interview of Keller. The interview took place in a neutral setting, documented by audio recording and transcript. Keller was informed of the reopened investigation and the evidence linking him to the case. His responses remained measured, but inconsistencies emerged. He adjusted his account of Christmas Eve, now acknowledging a brief drive to clear his head after midnight. He denied encountering Margaret Harlow or placing her in the alley, but the revisions weakened the credibility of his earlier statements. An arrest warrant was issued in March 2001. Keller was taken into custody without incident, his name appearing in local papers beneath headlines that referenced a crime nearly 16 years old. The coverage was restrained, reflecting both the gravity of the charge and the passage of time. Milwaukee residents who remembered the original case expressed quiet recognition rather than shock. Pretrial proceedings unfolded slowly. Defense motions challenged the admissibility of the DNA evidence, arguing degradation and potential contamination. Expert testimony detailed the preservation methods used by the evidence vault and the lab's validation protocols. The court ruled the evidence admissible, citing meticulous documentation and independent verification. The trial began in the fall, a season that mirrored the one in which Margaret had been lost. Jurors, many of them older men and women who remembered 1985 clearly, listened as prosecutors laid out the reconstructed timeline. They heard about the Christmas decorations still hanging in Margaret's window, the unopened gifts in her car, the cold alley behind the camera shop. The narrative avoided speculation, relying instead on records, measurements, and probability. The defense emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses and the circumstantial nature of the case. They pointed to the years that had passed, the fallibility of memory, and the limitations of technology. Yet the accumulation of detail proved difficult to dismiss. The vehicle footage, the bumper repair, the fiber match, and the ATM record formed a pattern that suggested intention and opportunity rather than chance. Expert witnesses explained the asphyxiation finding with clinical restraint, focusing on what it indicated about duration and proximity. There was no attempt to dramatize the event. The emphasis remained on control and sequence, on how the evidence fit together without requiring embellishment. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse corridors emptied into a gray November afternoon. Outside, the city prepared for Thanksgiving, storefronts already displaying Christmas lights. The deliberations lasted 2 days. On the second afternoon, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree intentional homicide. Sentencing occurred weeks later. Keller received a term of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 35 years, consistent with statutes applicable at the time of the offense. The judge's remarks acknowledged the length of the investigation and the restraint shown in bringing the case forward only when evidence met modern standards. Margaret Harlow's name appeared once more in the paper, this time beneath an article noting the conviction. There were no photographs, no extended commentary. The report concluded with a brief reference to her age and the year she died, facts that had remained unchanged while everything else moved forward. The years following the conviction settled into a quieter register, one defined by administrative closure rather than public reckoning. Court records were finalized, appeals logged and later denied, and the case file that had once circulated between desks was sealed and indexed under resolved homicides. Milwaukee's cold case unit moved on to other names, other winters, carrying with it the procedural lessons learned from a crime that waited patiently for technology to catch up. For investigators who had inherited the file late in their careers, the outcome provided a restrained sense of completion. There were no celebrations, only acknowledgments entered into internal memos noting the effectiveness of evidence preservation and the value of revisiting overlooked materials. The silent camera behind the repair shop became a reference point in training discussions, an example of how mundane precautions could acquire significance decades later. Analog footage, once dismissed as unusable, had proven durable enough to bridge generations of inquiry. Margaret Harlow's remaining family members were notified formally through letters that summarized the verdict and sentence without commentary. Those closest to her had learned long before to live without expectation. The confirmation of responsibility did not restore what had been lost, but it did correct the record. Her death was no longer an unresolved question lingering in archives. It had a cause, a timeline, and a legal conclusion. The physical spaces connected to the case continued to change. The camera repair shop closed in the early 1990s, its building later converted into offices. The alley was repaved, its walls repainted, the camera long since removed. Downtown corridors grew busier as redevelopment advanced, and the rhythms of December commerce intensified. Each Christmas season brought crowds, lights, and music to streets that once emptied early under the weight of cold. Few passers-by knew what had occurred there, and fewer still needed to. Daniel Keller entered the state correctional system quietly, processed like any other inmate whose crime predated the digital age. His appeals focused on procedural arguments rather than claims of innocence, and they failed to persuade reviewing courts. As years passed, his name receded from public notice, appearing only in routine parole eligibility listings that carried no commentary. The law had done what it was designed to do, not swiftly, but thoroughly. For the detectives who first responded in 1985, retirement had already come. Some learned of the conviction secondhand, through brief articles or internal newsletters. For them, the case represented a reminder of limits that once constrained their work. Film had to be developed, databases searched manually, and patterns recognized without computational aid. The resolution did not diminish those efforts. It contextualized them within a longer arc of progress. Milwaukee's local press marked the case's closure with restraint. A short retrospective appeared near the end of the year, noting how a forgotten piece of evidence had endured. The article avoided dramatization, focusing instead on process and patience. Readers, many of them older, recognized the cadence. It matched their own understanding of time, of how some answers arrive only after years of waiting. In the archives, Margaret's file now rests among other resolved cases, its contents preserved for record rather than pursuit. The original missing person flyer, yellowed at the edges, remains attached to the front. It shows a young woman at the beginning of adult life, unaware of the seasons she would never see. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, New Year's transitions, all absent from her future but present in the memories of those who knew her. The case left behind no sweeping reforms, no dramatic policy shifts. Its significance lay in accumulation, in the confirmation that careful documentation mattered even when outcomes were delayed. The fibers collected, the film stored, the notes taken in winter handwriting all contributed to a result that honored procedure over urgency. As the city continues to mark time through holidays and anniversaries, the story endures quietly, not as a warning but as a record. A crime committed in the margins of a season defined by gathering and warmth was answered by persistence rather than spectacle. The silent camera did not solve the crime alone, but it refused to forget. In that refusal, It preserved the possibility of truth until someone was ready to see it. The procedural aftermath extended into educational use, with anonymized summaries circulated among law enforcement agencies across the state. The emphasis was not on novelty, but on endurance, on how evidence integrity across decades could withstand scrutiny when handled conservatively. Chain of custody logs, once considered routine paperwork, were cited as decisive factors that allowed modern courts to trust older materials. This reinforcement of fundamentals resonated with officers trained in an era of rapid technological turnover. Seasonal context remained an undercurrent in the final assessments. Analysts noted how holiday schedules influenced witness availability, business closures, and patrol patterns. The Christmas lull had thinned the streets, altered routines, and created assumptions that delayed recognition of deviation. Such observations were folded into broader discussions about temporal risk, reminding investigators that crimes do not pause for calendars, but investigations must account for them. Community memory proved selective. In neighborhoods near the discovery site, longtime residents recalled a general unease from the mid-'80s without attaching names or details. The specifics had faded, replaced by other concerns, other years. This erosion of memory underscored the importance of institutional recall, of records that outlast individual attention spans. Without them, the case would have remained an absence rather than a conclusion. Margaret Harlow's employment records were archived according to retention schedules, her time cards microfilmed and stored. To an administrator, they were routine artifacts. To investigators, they had been anchors, fixing her movements within a narrow window. The mundane nature of such documents contrasted with their later weight, illustrating how ordinary systems can become evidentiary frameworks under scrutiny. The forensic advancements that enabled the DNA match were themselves products of incremental refinement. No single breakthrough transformed the case. Instead, improvements in sensitivity, contamination control, and statistical interpretation converged. This gradualism aligned with the case's overall character, one defined by accumulation rather than revelation. When parole reviews eventually occur, they will be administrative exercises bound by statute, informed by risk assessments and institutional behavior. They will not revisit the evidence or the narrative. That work is complete. The justice system, having reached a lawful outcome, will proceed according to its established rhythms, indifferent to symbolism. For those who encounter the case today through brief summaries or training materials, its lesson is understated. It demonstrates that resolution does not require spectacle, only consistency. It affirms that patience, paired with preservation, can compensate for initial limitations. In a profession often measured by immediate results, such examples provide balance. The city's winters continue to arrive early, bringing darkness by late afternoon and quiet to side streets. Snow still settles in alleys, altering surfaces and muffling sound. Cameras now watch from every angle, digital and immediate, but their presence does not guarantee prevention, only record. The responsibility to interpret remains human. Margaret's name is spoken rarely now, usually within professional contexts, yet the fact of her life and death persists within the system that ultimately acknowledged it. That acknowledgement, formal and restrained, is the final measure of resolution available. There are no restored futures, only corrected histories. As another December passes, the case occupies its proper place, not at the center of attention, but within the ledger of work done carefully and finished. The silent camera that once clicked in the cold has long stopped, but the record it kept continues to justify the effort that preserved it. In reviewing the complete arc, Supervisors noted that the case reinforced a principle often stated but rarely tested over such distance. Time does not negate evidence if evidence is respected. The methodical pace, once a liability, became an asset when re-examination occurred under stricter standards. Each decision made in 1985, from refrigeration of film to conservative handling of trace materials, aligned inadvertently with future requirements. For a generation that values order, accountability, and the steady application of rules, the outcome carries a sober reassurance. Systems can function, even imperfectly, when individuals commit to procedure. The resolution did not rely on chance confessions or dramatic turns, but on verification repeated until doubt narrowed. Milwaukee records the case as closed, but its influence remains embedded in practice. New investigators are reminded that today's overlooked detail may be tomorrow's fulcrum. In that understanding, the story concludes without flourish, grounded in the quiet certainty that persistence, measured across years, can still arrive at truth. The calendar turns, holidays recur, and files rest. What endures is a standard upheld, a life acknowledged, and a city reminded that answers may wait, but they do not disappear when care is taken. Records are kept and attention eventually returns to what winter once tried to conceal. Closure in this sense is not noise but completion, entered into margins, stamped, dated, and left to stand, sufficient, lawful, and final. It remains so season after season, without revision, ended.